Hey friends, Jeff here with a new episode of Conversations Life Science Leaders Aren't Having. Today we welcome Spiro Rombotis. Spiro is the longtime CEO at Cyclacel, where they are a pioneer in the field of cell cycle biology to treat cancer. And they're specifically addressing the growing problem of resistance of the body against cancer therapies and drugs. In our conversation, Spiro brings his ability to communicate the challenges in the industry, but also the details of what Cyclacel is doing and what the field of genetics is doing in the world of cancer treatment. I think you're going to enjoy Spiro's ability to communicate clearly and bring an understanding of what's possible and what's next. Spiro, welcome. Welcome to the show. So happy to have you as a guest today and excited to dive into what I know is going to be a really rich conversation.
Thank you for having me.
So I just did a brief introduction of you and who you are to me in the short time that we've gotten to know each other. As we ask all of our guests to do, share with us what you're up to in the world.
Well, the company I'm employed by is called Cyclacel Pharmaceuticals. We're a small outfit of below 20 employees based in the US and the UK. We've been involved in the area of cancer drug discovery and development for a long time, over 20 years. And have reached a stage of development which we call mid-stage in clinical trials, where our drugs start to show efficacy in patients after we have adequately studied their safety in earlier studies. So it's a very exciting moment for the company, and I think for patients, if we can help them improve their quality of life, let alone improve their survival.
And I was struck as I was preparing, you're coming up on your, I think, 27th year Cyclacel. And I'm curious, you described your current state as a company. I guess when I see a tenure that long, I'm wondering what stands out to you about the changes that you've seen. It could be at Cyclacel, could be in the industry. I'm always interested. What stands out to you as far as what's changed in the last 27 years?
Well, I've been actually in the industry for 37 years.
Right.
Worked for 2 pharmas, 2 biotechs before Cyclacel, who's my 5th employer. And it is a very long time. And I think I can say with some degree of confidence that we made giant strides in our ability to contain cancer. We're not necessarily winning each battle, but we're probably certainly heading the right direction in terms of the war against cancer. I think in the last quarter century or so, 25, 27 years, we've made dramatic advances because since the human genome was mapped at the turn of the millennium, we have acquired a lot more tools to start to understand the diversity of the cancer is. People often ask me, is there a cure for cancer nearby? That is, I think, a very difficult way to explain that it is not one disease, but hundreds. If we count the genetic profiles of the patients, possibly thousands of variants of cancer we're trying to contain. And I think it's impossible to beat several thousand disease variants in a single go. So it's going to be actually what we call precision medicine. It will be drugs that are directed to specific patients or patient subgroups by genetics. And therefore, we're going to go away from the Hippocratic concept of defining cancer by the organ, the anatomy in which it is located. So I think I'm most excited about that. The fact that we now have these wonderful tools where, a bit like children in a toy shop, these tools allow us to help more patients, potentially spare patients who wouldn't benefit from our medicines by not offering them if they don't have the particular genetic type. And if I'm correct, we might even get all the way to the market and help a much larger number of people.
You said to me in our earlier call, as we've advanced in our understanding and usage of this whole genetic map, you said the phrase that we've learned the alphabet, we're starting to construct sentences, but we're not yet writing poetry. Could you just unpack that unpack that?
Sure.
It's really, I think, a very beautiful way to start to understand the baby steps that we're still taking.
That's very kind of you. So essentially, we have indeed 4 letters in the human code of life. DNA is composed of these 4 letters, A, T, G, C, and so on, and they have innumerable number of sequences and permutations. And essentially, what happens in cancer is that cancer cells that used to be normal cells degenerate into this process of uncontrolled dividing or proliferation, hijack the code of life. They insert errors in the DNA sequence. And then by using a process called transcription, this is passed on to daughter cells. The way it is passed on is by copying one side of the double helix of DNA using a tool that everybody knows in the universe now, which is mRNA, messenger RNA. And that is how one cell passes to its daughter cells, whatever the code of life is. So in normal patients, that is intact code. In diseased patients, this code contains errors. And of course, over time, these errors become more established, the tumor prevails, and the patient succumbs. In first-line treatments today, when we treat patients in the first-line setting, presumably with medications, sometimes post-surgery, sometimes radiotherapy, we do encounter some activity, but inevitably the tumor escapes and comes back. So the idea of writing letters and spelling is about understanding the range of mutations available, the range of changes to the code of life, how we could target some of them with pharmaceuticals. And then writing poetry is perhaps the Dr. Spock idea of cancer, that you go into a lab, you get a small amount of blood into the machine, and then it tells you what drug you need to synthesize for that tumor type. You give it to the patient improves. We're not there yet. But we are in that in-between stage of writing letters. We're writing perhaps even full sentences in some cancer types. We have very meaningful advances, for example, in non-small cell lung cancer. There's the advent of frontline drugs that are typically immunotherapy, chemotherapy combinations. And now we're dealing with a bigger problem. It's a high-class problem, but a problem that when people lose the benefit 3 to 5 years later, how do we give them another 2 or 3 years of life, maybe more? So I think if I were to deconstruct this analogy, I would say that cancer development is a very incremental process. There's no magic one cure for all, let alone an instant solution. It's a continuum which requires lots of foot soldiers and a lot of personal sacrifice to get to the solutions that patients demand.
It's fascinating. And you described the last 30 plus years, but specifically quarter of a century, 25 years, Cyclacel, of the industry and cancer research and the genetics. I'm wondering, as you reflect on your own story, what stands out to you for you personally over the last quarter century?
Well, when I started in the company, I was attracted when the recruiters came calling about this potential new opportunity. I had a very nice job. I was doing well. But there was this world-class academic called David Lane, who was the founder of Cyclacel. He had discovered a very famous gene called p53. p53 is mutated in 2/3 of human beings that have cancer, and though it itself is not controllable by medicines, other switches downstream of p53 are. So he had come up with this proposal that a particular type of enzymes called CDKs, cyclin-dependent kinases, in particular CDKs 2 and 9, when inhibited at the same time by a pharmaceutical, could restore some of the processes that we mentioned earlier that cancer cells hijack and activate the body's own control mechanism to weed out dangerous cells, something which is called apoptosis, which essentially means programmed death for useless cells that are taken out into the circulation and cleared by the kidney. That's how the body stops cells that have no longer a function to play. And of course, cancer cells fall in that category. So the David Lane hypothesis was something that I dedicated half of my professional life to test whether this is true or not with health patients. This comes in many stages. For example, the first order question is that valid as a hypothesis as a single agent, as monotherapy? If we give this drug to patients, can we find any benefit when we give it alone? Most of the time in today's complex world of cancer therapy, we need combinations, 2 or sometimes 3 drugs even to treat patients because the disease has become so complicated over several exposures that are below the lethal level to cancer cells. So the cancer cells get smart, they evolve, and of course we need more drugs to at the same time suppress multiple circuits that provide this redundancy, this ability of the cell to escape. So CDKs2 and 9 are a very controversial topic. There is a Nobel Prize behind the discovery of CDK enzymes, awarded in 2001, 3 years after Cyclacel was started. But the idea of which of the 20 or so enzymes known to science and the CDK family to go after has been very controversial. We know that the first order of drugs that came out of this class, called CDK4/6 inhibitors, is now a huge product category. There are 3 or 4 drugs are approved in that category. The cumulative sales are about $8 billion, and they're approved for the major subtype of breast cancer. But for some peculiar reason, this class did not escape the confines of breast cancer, and no other indications have been approved by the FDA, even though there were hints of activity in earlier studies. So part of the mission of what we call a next-generation CDK inhibitor, like the one that David Lane proposed some 20 plus years ago, was to test it after the frontline drugs fail. In some cases also including the CDK4/6 drugs. Could a CDK2/9 drug help a patient who failed CDK4/6 therapy? So this has been probably the biggest theme of my journey in the last quarter century, just to test the hypothesis. That's the card that fell in front of me and my colleagues at Cyclacel. And our mission, the one that society expects us to fulfill, to turn this card upside up and see if this hypothesis is true and can we therefore help patients, whether as a single agent or in combinations.
And one of the top ideas that we explore a lot with your peers, CEO peers in the space, is the idea of failure. And I can imagine in turning this inside out and upside down to test this and to validate it and to leverage it, there's been lots of failure. I'm wondering, as you think about the journey, for you, why isn't failure demoralizing?
Well, it's certainly taxing, but it's not demoralizing if one starts with the right assumptions and the right value system. Value system is important. As I said before, there's an analogy to war. The war on cancer is like any other war. There are foot soldiers that have to accept that the odds of being killed in battle are high. If you start thinking about that, you can function as a soldier. So you have to put that to one side and think of the bigger picture. The benefit to society only occurs if thousands of compounds are tested, the majority of which will fail, and 50 or 60 will be approved by the FDA every year. Nearly half of those are for cancer indications. These are the mathematics of this process. So if one agrees to commit the enormous personal and other sacrifices are required to get there as a foot soldier, then of course we accept failure. Failure is how we learn in this business. Oftentimes we may wonder, for example, why does the government insist that companies publish data from previous studies? The answer is simple, because if the next company picks up and avoids repeating the same mistake, then society wins. You have a chance to discover drugs for others perhaps were not so fortunate early on. So studying failure is a fundamental part of how we learn and a very important part of the success recipe. There's surely a lot of luck, but also careful observation. Luck favors the prepared. So if one has the fortune of observing in the clinic certain properties that were not spotted before, this could lead to perhaps an easier road to bringing a drug to the bedside than if one just took a shot on a well-known target, but that particular drug turned out not to be a very good inhibitor of that target. Again, failure is a very fundamental part of the sinew of drug development. We accept it, we learn from it, and we move forward. And we have to accept that most of the times, unfortunately, the numbers are against us.
You pointed to this value structure that enables you to be able to see failure for what it is necessary and important. I'm wondering how have your, not necessarily around failure, but if you look at your professional life, how have your value structures needed to change?
Well, I think there are certain beginning values, if you want, that are not negotiable. We're here to serve patients, not to pursue glory, financial success, or distinction. These are nice accoutrements, nice measurements of one's effort, but they come after the patient or the doctor. Doctor, I think I feel better after I get the medicine you proposed to me. Only then can we possibly get rewarded. So there are some values that are simply not negotiable. We have to pursue them. We're here to serve patients, unmet medical need, and if we abandon that, then bad things happen. So other values, though, have to do with our understanding of how society funds this enormous war, right? It's an amorphous war. It's been lasting for decades, but it does have components that are important to function properly so that we continue to allocate resources. And in a capitalist society, whether one likes it or not, that is essential. The ability of society to allocate resources for guns or butter is a classic analogy that most human beings understand. But in the development of cancer drugs, it's about resources being put in the hands of the investigative teams, whether they're companies or investigators or hospitals, by society, which happens one of two ways. Government grant, which is a minority of the funds available, and the big gorilla is investors. Investors motivated by the chance to reward, allocate resources to the most promising projects. Some projects get funded, some do not. So those that get funded move forward if they have satisfactory data. Now, it could be that dislocation can occur in this process. It's possible that external factors, let's say wars of the conventional type, geopolitics, inflation, all of these conditions, the black swan events of the last few years, for sure the pandemic, can cause massive disruptions in the risk-reward calculus that investors engage in before they allocate resources to specific projects or companies. And that can create enormous disruption of the innovation cycle. So if society expects 50 to 60 drugs to be approved, but let's say for the last 3 years we had a major disruption of the funding continuum, then surely we're not going to get the same number of drugs. If 1,000 drugs don't start at the starting gun, we get the 50 or 60 at the finish line, then we might get half or a third of that approved because simply we had too few projects in the beginning. Hopefully, as things go forward, we'll get more deliberate and our batting average, our chance of success improves. But the reality is that the funding cycle is critical. We cannot fund innovation in a centrally planned economy. It's not going to work. And that's the reason why many drugs are made in America. America is the epitome, the apex, if you want, of how in a capitalist economy we allocate resources for high-risk projects, whether they are high-tech projects or drilling for natural resources or discovering cancer drugs. They have very similar characteristics. Very high risk, but very high reward. So values, again, are important, but one have to understand that the way that the capital system works isn't always perfect. We believe that we can fund projects, we move forward with that idea, but we may find that investors have what we call risk-off sentiment for a very long period that, of course, will threaten innovation. And it's important that we stay resilient and keep fighting until we can get resources to answer the next question in our projects.
There's a quote that I had shared with you in advance by the author John Ruskin. He says, the greatest toil of our work, or the greatest reward of our toil, greatest reward of our toil is not what we get, the results that you just pointed to that are nice, but it's who we become through our work, through our toil. I'm wondering, who have you become?
That's a great Ruskin quote you cited, which I fully subscribe to. So I've always been interested in medicine. I trained in public health. My graduate studies at Northwestern University many years ago, and of course that was something I committed my life to. But initially thought I would progress through life as a hospital manager or a health service provider or some kind of similar profession in the public health arena. What I realized after having a short exposure to a hospice in suburban Chicago is that that is a thankless task. People dying out of cancer with that much hope. I felt I had to do something, put my own pebble on the beach. So I've become more of a humanist over the years. I realized that the odds are so overwhelming that we have to allocate a substantial amount of effort. I want to put my own minute contribution to that effort. And I think if we consider how many families get touched by cancer, how many of our friends and acquaintances come to us and ask, I have a family member or a friend who has this or that type of cancer, what clinical trials are available for them to go after? Which of course implies they have tried and failed, both approved and investigational drugs. They go into clinical trials as the last stage of development options available to them before they go to hospice care. So I've learned over the years that there is no fixed answer to these intractable problems. There's only a lot of sacrifice, continuous effort, resilience in order to start to provide solutions. And that's why I think thousands of people like me are toiling at these companies. They understand these dynamics. They're here to serve patients. So over the years, we become more humanist than perhaps when we started.
Well, I imagine, I just think of my own story. I think as I've aged, I turned 50 this year. So I have also become, to use your word, humanist. And for my own story, no one could have taught me that. No one. I just learned a college professor passed away, a dear college professor. He could not have taught me servant leadership or the humanistic ideal. I could only learn that by experience. And with that in mind, I'm not sure if you agree or disagree on that, but I'm wondering, how do you, as you're bringing along, I know you have a small team, but you probably have an opportunity to influence a lot of people who are still yet coming up. How do you mentor or support someone to bring them along in that way of thinking?
That's an excellent question. Of course, leadership is the answer. And one has to lead by example, especially in smaller, flatter enterprises like Cyclacel. There's no hierarchy. Hierarchy is outmoded. People today are in knowledge industry like ours operate because they're motivated. They feel they're contributing. Of course, they have to be rewarded, support their families and so forth, but they're not there for the comfort of having a pensioner's life with ample financial rewards. That's not what they do, what we do, right? They have to choose to come every day when they come into the office or virtual office because they believe they're contributing and they're earning their keep. So motivation is a relatively straightforward task if one selects their colleagues carefully. And there are some Darwinian selection criteria. If somebody goes into a job interview with a small company and asks the CEO, what is your travel policy in this company? I can promise you this person is not going to make it. They don't understand how small companies work. When Cyclacel was very young, back in the lab in the United Kingdom, we had signs underneath the light switches which said, turn me off, help fund your next experiment. Just to remind people what this is about, right? So to learn to live a frugal life, rather the splendors, if you want, of life in a large company, which may offer you lots of feature comforts, and at the same time, perhaps not be as rewarding in the sense that you're not as close to the patient as we are in small companies. All these things feature into the motivational question that you posed to me. And I think most workers today in biotech companies understand that. That's why they come. They're motivated by that. They have a vertical learning curve. They're in close touch with extremely intelligent people, the investigators and their supporting staff in the clinics around the world. It's a cosmopolitan industry, so you get to know people across the world. We establish supply chains that easily span the globe and are therefore vulnerable to disruptions, as we discussed a minute ago. So it's a very rewarding career if one accepts the values we discussed earlier and the probability of failure. If one does that, then the tolerance for the ambiguity of our business is manageable. If they don't, they'll usually crash and leave relatively soon after they join, which is, of course, a hiring mistake. So if I learned anything all these years is that people vote with their feet. And if one selects them carefully in the beginning, they'll probably stick around to see what happens, so long as there are resources, and therefore the managerial task of overseeing them becomes a lot simpler than in a different, perhaps more labor-intensive type of company where hundreds of employees are toiling in the 1960s model, perhaps not in a knowledge-intensive industry, but certain industries that rely on lots of operators, for example, manning switchboards. It's a very different world.
Yeah. I think if I think about my last 10 years of working and serving in this space, if I was to share one thing, I think if this would be it to the public, to point, because drug development, biotech, I think largely has a less than stellar view by the public. There's this perception of big pharma, which of course exists, and there's the negatives that go with that. But back to the one thing, if I could show the public one thing, is the hundreds and hundreds of people that I've been able to serve that you're pointing to in this last comment, of people with these motivations, this work ethic, this commitment to the patient, to turning the light switch off at the end of the night, to make sure that there was funding for and funds for the next experiment. I think that would be one thing that I would love for every person to be able to see, that because unfortunately the myth of big pharma and the negatives that go with that connotation override this ideal that I get to witness and you get to experience every day.
That's a great point that you raise, and of course is a big current social and political debate about how we fund innovation in healthcare in the United States, which is the world's medicine chest. So if we don't do it well here, I think it's a woe for humankind across the globe. I think there are several thoughts that come to mind. First of all, we need big pharma. Big pharma enterprises have a very vital role to play in the ecosystem. Consider, for example, a drug which is approaching the end of its patent life and is still being produced by a big pharma. And an outage of this drug can cause enormous misery, possibly early death to thousands of people across the globe. So small companies cannot do that. That's not what investors are willing to fund. So big pharma play a critical role to provide the inertia that keeps the healthcare system going when it comes to pharmaceutical therapy. By the way, that is less than 15%, closer to 10% of the national trillions spent on healthcare. Pharmaceutical treatment expenditure by the U.S. government is in the low teens compared to perhaps hospital spending, or the cost tagged on by intermediaries like pharmacy benefit managers or insurers, which of course add to the ultimate bill that we pay in our taxes every year. But it's important to understand that while we may think of big pharma by virtue of being big in the context of banking or insurance, that is not a fair comparison. There is a bidirectional bridge between biotech and big pharma, which tells me, as a hopefully astute observer of our industry and its human dynamics, that people that cross that bridge in both directions share the same value system. Big pharma is a very important part of the innovation continuum. We need big pharma to provide the inertia that supplies society with drugs that may have lost or near the end of their patent exclusivity period. We also need it because big pharma are massive distribution organizations and therefore can improve patient access, especially when it comes to the very important topical matter of diversity, equity, and inclusion, the idea that we can get every member of society to have equal access to clinical trials as well as approved medicines. Big pharma has a huge role to play there. Small biotechs are a very different environment, of course. They are much riskier, they have narrow scope, and they take projects that perhaps big pharma wouldn't undertake early on. But they obviously have an expectation that if they're successful, perhaps even before the product reaches the market, that big pharma might acquire the asset and moving forward at higher speed with more resources. So in some ways, this is a continuum with multiple compartments. Society needs both to work seamlessly and hopefully have a strong interaction. And there are no distinctions. We don't make any distinctions in our environment, whether somebody has worked for pharma or for biotech. If they're experienced, they can fulfill the job, then that's equally important. So I think this is a public perception which is inaccurate. We need to work to change it. And very importantly, we need to make the public understand that this is a very delicate system because the invisible hand, Adam Smith's concept, right, the invisible hand is running innovation. Any kind of external factors that disrupt that will directly affect people's demands for new medicines. And there's nothing more frustrating for a patient or a parent to be told that their loved one or the child cannot have a medicine because either it's not available, it wasn't manufactured, or nobody discovered it for a rare disease, for example. This is a moment of extreme disappointment for many people. And of course, we are here to change that. And we have to do it with a view that we're all in this fight together.
You're pointing to a topic that would most likely fit under this heading of conversations life science leaders aren't having enough of. The demystification of the connotation that comes with small and big pharma. I'm wondering, what else would you put under that heading of conversations life science leaders aren't having or not having enough of?
A topic that's very near to my heart, Jeff, is the question of access to clinical trials. What are clinical trials? They are state-of-the-art medicine. I could certainly take you from A to B in a car with a carburetor and fuel-injected engine. But if I could take you there in an electric car, you might have a new experience, which is possibly a higher quality because you're spewing fewer fumes and you're going there with a much more quiet and relaxing ride. In a similar way, innovation is very important, right? Just like we have innovation, other parts of social activity, whether it's transportation or chemicals or industrial goods, medicines are a constant flux, constant state of innovation. So what life science leaders often don't talk about is the vanishing small percentage of patients that volunteer for clinical trials. Imagine that if only 8% of patients show up for clinical trials, sometimes it's less in certain indications, we're very close to stopping clinical research. Without patients, we cannot test the drugs. And it's important people are actually willing to have the altruism to say, I have an intractable, possibly terminal disease, but I'm willing to suffer some discomfort, possibly big discomfort in the last weeks of my life so that somebody after me could benefit. That is the ultimate humanist idea. I mean, Oliver Wendell Holmes, that great American, described it as meliorism, the idea that if I can help a human being, everything else is less important. That is the superb humanist value. So think about clinical trial access as a very important social prerogative that we have not given sufficient attention. And we at the industry know how important it is, and therefore we have a moral obligation to communicate that to those around us, to the community at large. It is very important to not only increase the number of patients that show up for trial, but also to offer access to diverse members of our society who may not have access to healthcare because of lack of information, for example. Not always lack of education, oftentimes lack of information. It could be both, but it could also be just lack of knowledge where one could go, how one approach a diagnosis. And of course, in a busy medical profession, where people are trying to see as many patients as possible in the span of working day, oftentimes that type of counseling is unavailable. There are social workers that can do that, but they also tend to be overworked. So we have a job to do. That job is to inform people as life science leaders that access to clinical trials is a social prerogative. It's something we need to popularize and democratize, and we need to increase it so that we can accelerate drug development, we can accelerate answering intractable problems, and we can accelerate access to innovation by every member of our society.
And what is the on-ramp for that? What's the on-ramp for that conversation and that the raising of that priority?
So this we have regulations from the capital markets, regulatory authorities, for what we can say in a company filing, for example, annual report and so on. And we have also nowadays environmental, social, and governance requirements for those statutory reporting. Imagine we had a DEI requirement, diversity, equity, and inclusion requirement to report how many patients in our trials come from diverse ethnic groups, for example, in our society. That is actually an active debate with regulators and other political authorities, but I think it has to come from the industry as well. We have to volunteer that information, we have to reach out to our community, especially communities that are underprivileged and sometimes communities out of reach geographically, and make sure that we have done our part to popularize access to clinical trials. Demystify the idea people are testing subjects. They're volunteers altruistically offering knowledge that we all need so we can go to the next generation of patients who have better fortune with some bad news diagnosis.
What strikes me is this notion that I've been sitting with, that we have, I'll use the word evolved, into a very hyper-individualistic society. And what you're pointing to is a very tribal, community-oriented view of society and of the world. And I'm not a doom and gloom guy. Like, there's no hope, and let's stop trying. But it strikes me that you're really pointing to community, and a tribal mentality, that the sum of the parts are greater than any one individual, and that is no small task to shift that tide that I experience in our world.
It's a great point that you raise. I mean, we are an individualistic society when it comes to many pursuits. But when it comes to dealing with intractable diseases like cancer, we have to be cells, members of a bigger organism. Each cell is not as important as the entire organism. So if we are hopefully learning from each other and helping each other, whether it is in the drug discovery bench or the bedside or even as a patient volunteering for trials, is very important. But this sense of duty and responsibility is not just civics. I think it's just good sense. The survival of our species depends on that. Now, we can easily degrade as a species. We know in many examples in nature that species became extinct. Obviously, we're not about to do so, but it is an incremental process, right? So if we are able to harness the massive amount of information coming out of biomedical research today, we will have a much better future when it comes to medicines available to treat difficult diseases. And that is an opportunity missed if we didn't somehow recruit society to support that.
Yeah. One of my final question for you, Spiro, is one we ask all of our guests. I'm going to give you in this moment a magic wand to wave over the offices of all your CEO peers. And that wave of the wand is going to plant the seed for one conversation they're going to have in the coming week. What's that one conversation you would love your CEO peers to have over the next 7 to 10 days?
That's an interesting question because, of course, there are thousands of topics that one could think. Probably somewhere at the very top of the agenda is the application of artificial intelligence to what we do. And there is a lot of talk, as often happens in the front end of the wave of a technical revolution, as AI clearly is, that tends to precede reality, right? People think that AI is the magic solution to many problems, when in reality, it's one more powerful but incremental tool to do what we do better. So what I would hope CEOs can steer the conversation to is the reality check of where is AI most likely to help. For example, one could imagine at the laboratory bench when we are trying to model how compounds work, AI could be enormously helpful. If we could sink the leaky ships early on before they leave the harbor, we have many more projects that will make it to the other end. So that's going to be dramatic if you position this across the scale of the industry. The other end is clinical trials. Clearly, there is talk, even within the FDA, of synthetic clinical trials, the idea that we don't have to expose patients to useless placebo, which is part of the statistical testing environment that we all been regulated by, or perhaps use historical data cleansed and purified by AI techniques to create a very good picture of what patients that might have gotten a placebo would experience, and thereby not have this terrible lottery where you have the patient in an informed consent interview with the physician to be told you have 50% chance of getting the drug, 50% chance of getting sugar or your terminal disease. And that, again, reduces access to clinical trials, reduces the volunteer percentage that show up for trials and so on, and slows down innovation. So there are all these wonderful ideas, but there are few that are actionable in the next 3 to 5 years, which in my opinion could move the needle. And that's where CEOs have a duty, in my humble opinion, take a leadership role, harness the debate down to the few things that matter, not let it go by power of imagination to where it is not relevant. We're not going to be at Dr. Spock level of medicine anytime soon, but we can certainly do a lot more things to increase the number of patients that show up for the trials and also to increase our chance of success.
I love that. I love that conversation. As we wrap here, Spiro, is there anything else you'd like to highlight at Cyclacel?
There is something I would like to highlight, and that's a tribute to my colleagues who are like myself, who are toiling there for a long time. Some have been there for over 20 years, like I have, some for a bit less, but all of them are biotech lifers, whether it's Cyclacel or another company. They're there for the Darwinian selection reasons we covered earlier. And the reason I want to mention them is because of what happened a few months ago. In the end of the fall 2023, we announced a major empirical discovery in our clinical trials with our lead drug, the CDK2/9 inhibitor we mentioned before. It's a drug called fadraciclib, or Fadra for short. So essentially, we found by looking back at the sub-100 total number of patients we treated with this drug since the pandemic until now, with both the intravenous and the oral version, that those patients that had benefit, either a partial or complete response or even stable disease, nearly all of them had the same genomic observation on their sequencing scan. This is not something we planned for. It's retrospective and therefore cannot be planned. And it's also fortunate. It's fortunate because, as like I said, luck favors the prepared, because we had some sharp investigators and sharp Cyclacel colleagues who spotted the opportunity. These two mutations, if you want to call them that, they're actually called abnormalities in that trade talk, are actually found in 20 to 40% of many solid tumors. And there's nothing approved by the FDA to treat those patients. These are called CDKN2A and CDKN2B. They're not enzymes, they're genes. They're genes that actually are the body's own tumor suppressors. But in cancer, in many types of 20, 40% of solid cancers, they don't function. Their function is lost. What we call a loss of function mutation. We've discovered that a large number of the patients that have been in our trials, and in particular those that responded either by tumor shrinkage or stable disease, had this profile. I can't tell you how important this is. That is, of course, a hypothesis that we can then test in phase 2 trials that we're not ready to start. We'll call this hypothesis generating data. The citation I'm providing here is to the people that spotted that. It wasn't me. I'm not medically trained. It was the investigators and the Cyclacel people supporting the trials. That team are the ones who discover that. We hope to have an announcement at a major medical meeting very soon. We have big cancer meetings coming up usually in the middle of the year. So hopefully after scientific review, we can reveal more details. But this is an exciting moment for any group in our business. And I want to just mention how hard work, commitment, and shrewd observation sometimes gives you these rare moments of satisfaction to actually have this exciting, possibly provocative idea that we could test in further trials and see if it holds up in a much bigger number of patients.
Outstanding. I love your acknowledgement of them, of your team. Well, we'll put information in our show notes where people can find out more about Cyclacel, and how they can connect with you on LinkedIn. Spiro, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I appreciate so much for a non-science person in this field to have the curtain pulled back in a way that I can more easily understand it. And I know our audience will feel the same way. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure talking to you, Jeff.